All right. Hello, everybody. It's time for your first lesson from the closet. We're going to start our World War II unit by talking about the rise of dictators throughout Europe in the interwar period, which is what we would have been talking about the week after spring break. But, we got extra time because disease outbreak and fun things like that. And I'll apologize now for the glare in my glasses that you're going to get lovely screenception, but it's late and I'm tired and I can't read without my glasses on. So sorry, I look like a weird robot. I want to show you the accompanying sections of the interactive notebook that you can be working on after this set of notes. And my goal is to kind of do that for each section. That way, when we meet during office hours throughout the week or you have emails, we can kind of connect the dots to specific sections. So I'm going to share my screen really fast. So here's your interactive notebook. We've done a couple of them throughout the semester. When you are looking at the pages that kind of correspond with this set of notes, this illustrated vocabulary you'll kind of work on throughout that, since this is a more stage setting lesson, that we don't talk about any of these terms really at this point. But this is the lesson that's the jumping off point for the third page, or the second actual assignment in the interactive notebook, which is the rise of militarism and dictators. What this asks you to do is look at what is happening in each country during each of the decades that is listed in the interwar period. And you have links at the top of the document, which will give you some additional resources that you can look to fill in the blanks. So in terms of kind of setting the stage for the rise of dictators during World War II, the first thing that I kind of want you to do is this warm-up activity, right? You need to be thinking about where we were at several weeks ago when we hit a stopping point in history. So I want you to look at these questions and kind of pause the video and take a second to answer them to see where you're at. But you see in the image on the left of the screen that children are playing with stacks of marks, which was the German currency during the Weimar Republic. And you can see that they're making a nice little pyramid out of fat stacks of cash. So, this is definitely a good way to kind of think about the state of Germany after World War One. So think about how much physical currency these children are playing with, and then answer these three questions, right? Number one, what does this tell you about the value of the mark, right? The German dollar equivalent. How did this happen, right? Why did we get to a shift in the value of money? And then think about how people in Germany may have felt about this. So, take a second, pause the video, write down these answers, think about these answers, and this will be one of the things that we'll kind of talk about in terms of some actual discussion questions that will guide the office hours if you all don't have specific questions. So, in terms of talking about what creates the conditions for World War II, we're going to do something similar to what we did for World War I at times, right? We talked about Maine or Mania in terms of the different factors that set the stage for World War I to be a thing. The same thing is necessary with World War II, right? And there are several dictators throughout Europe at the time, but clearly the most infamous, notorious of them all is the man who kind of rises to power in Germany in Adolf Hitler. So one of the global events that kind of happens between World War I and World War II is the Great Depression. So what you're looking at is a map of Europe, and what you can see is the color of green will denote whether or not they saw a decline in industrial production of more or less than 30%, right? So in looking at France, Spain, Italy, Yugoslavia, Romania, you're seeing a decline up to 30%. In Austria, Germany, Poland, you're seeing an increase of over 30%. The areas that have the stripes going across are areas where outside of economic production, you are seeing a decline in economic activity from 1929 to 1932. And then the black is areas of economic revival. The bar graphs for each country is going to give you a number of people in thousands who were registering for unemployment or official unemployment numbers that were accumulated and reported by governments at the time in 1928, 1932, and 1934. And one of the trends that you'll notice is a huge spike in unemployment numbers writ large by the year 1932. And in several countries, you see the trend continue between 1932 and 1934. But then in some countries, you see a drop off, right? That you're seeing a reduction in unemployment, right? In the United Kingdom, you see a reduction of about 600,000 individuals who are registered for unemployment. In Germany, you see it cut in half, right? These numbers are kind of fluctuating, and you need to think about how or why the economy may be something that is creating a driving force for the behaviors of people. So we're going to break this lecture from this point on into a couple of chunks because I want to try and get you into 10-minute pieces at a time, so you don't have to listen to my Eeyorish voice drone on in one sitting. Like, you can listen to all of the videos back to back to back if you really don't like yourself. But you all know that I don't like to be long-winded in lecture, that I'll get more distracted and we'll watch dumb videos. And believe you me, I'll show you some Sabaton World War II videos in Google Classroom throughout. So the first country that we want to talk about that kind of shows the attitude of what is going on in Europe at the time is Spain. So Francisco Franco says, "We do not believe in government through the voting booth. Spain has no foolish dreams." So people wonder, why do we start to see the rise of authoritarianism, dictators, fascism, right, military regimes, personalist regimes in Europe? And part of that is people will look at democratic movements as something that have failed other areas of the world, right? Democracy is something that is bad in the eyes of the Germans, right, because they were crushed by democratic nations. They were tyrannical through things like the Treaty of Versailles, and, you know, democratic nations harmed other nations. You also see this kind of belief among fascist or authoritarians that individualism that comes with democracy is something that's problematic, because instead of worrying about the social good as a whole, we're only worried about ourself, which creates more conflict amongst the people of a nation. So, oops, when I made the box bigger, the box is now pointing at Portugal. This is very much Portugal. This is very much Spain. My bad. So the leader in Spain is General Francisco Franco, who's referred to as El Caudillo. And El Caudillo just means that he's a political strongman, and that's a term that you see used to describe like warlord or area type czars, even throughout Latin America today. He was a representative of the Falange Party, which was fascist. He took power in a military coup in a civil war and was assisted by the Germans and the Italians to stake his claim. But Spain is not one of these nations that you hear about a lot playing a role in World War II, because even though they are politically aligned with nations like Italy or Germany in terms of they believe the same things, or they should feel indebted to Germany or Italy for the same reasons, right? Because those two nations came to the aid of Spain, they end up staying neutral. And when we talk about some of the events that actually trigger the beginning of World War II, we'll kind of talk about why. And there's a lovely general cutout with Franco's head pasted on it. So we'll take a quick pause here and then dive into the big three countries that really start to impact the way we think about World War II, or for you all who are worried about filling out a sheet in your interactive notebook, the countries that matter more in terms of filling out that document. Okay, now it's time to talk about the big countries that kind of guide the sweeping changes in Europe throughout World War II. So first up on the list is Italy. So uh, Benito Mussolini, the fascist prime minister of Italy at the time, said, "Let us have a dagger between our teeth, a bomb in our hands, and an infinite scorn in our hearts." He is kind of reviving some of the elements of militarism and nationalism in this statement that we talked about leading into World War II, right? This notion of Italy needs to rise up and restake its claim to greatness that was kind of taken from it because of other prevailing social movements. So the leader of Italy, and it's the lovely boot-like country that you probably remember from your seventh grade world geography class, is there. The leader is Benito Mussolini. He is from the fascist party. He is a uh, hard right political authoritarian, again in lines with the way I talked about the leader of Spain a few moments ago. He promises to restore the glory of the ancient Roman Empire, right? And this is something that we've talked about each time we've pivoted back in the direction of people who see Rome as this pinnacle of, civilization. This notion that we need to rewind back to a prior point in time is something that is fairly common amongst fascist or far right ideologies. And again, he's saying we need to identify changes that have happened throughout our history and hard reset back to that point in time, back to the good old days of Rome. And he in terms of trying to increase Italy's ability to project power, to kind of play the colonialism game that we talked about during World War One, invades Ethiopia and Albania, uh, two areas in the Middle East, North Africa region. Hitler, is the gold standard of World War II, right? That, if you don't remember any name from World War II, everybody remembers Hitler, and he becomes the comparison of the ultimate evil. That anytime there's a leader that someone doesn't like, they connect them to Hitler. Uh, Adolf Hitler was a mastermind of kind of persuading, manipulating, moving crowds, bending them to his political will, right? That he is a very, very persuasive public speaker, and he was kind of the right man in the right place at the right time, rising to attempt to restore Germany to its position of greatness before it shoulders or has the blame of World War One thrust upon its shoulders. So he is the Fuhrer. He is the leader of the Third German Reich. And again, when I moved my box over, oops, there's Germany. So Adolf Hitler is the leader of Germany. He is the leader of the Nazi Party, which is a group we will kind of dive into at length in terms of looking at their ideology and how they attempted to manage the populations of Germany. But where he becomes notorious is attempting to find who was responsible for the negative economic conditions of Germany after World War One, right? That in the same way that Mussolini wanted to restore the glory of the Roman Empire, Hitler wants to attempt to find a way to restore German prosperity, to restore German economic growth, and he uses Jews as a scapegoat, right? That if you look at the bulk of people who worked in banks or owned businesses or things like that, throughout Germany, you had a large influx of a Jewish population kind of take control of those large engines of the economy. And when the economy failed after Germany had all of the World War One debt thrust upon its shoulders, instead of going, oh, it was the the treaty at the end of the first war that makes us, in an economically bad position. No, in his treatise Mein Kampf, a book that he writes, kind of outlining his ideology, highlighting, his belief in eugenics to control a population. He uses Jews as scapegoats, as the people who should be targeted and removed, because, right, if the Jews go away, someone new takes control of the economy, and in theory, it would increase. He increases his um, military power, military might, kind of showing his power to the democratic nations of the world by taking the Rhineland, Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia, areas that Germany were forced out of, or areas that were newly created after World War One. Like I said, in kind of introducing him, right? There is a gravitas that surrounds Adolf Hitler, right? He just was intoxicating and could command and control crowds. And you can see, right, seas of people would line up wall to wall to show up to listen to him kind of speak, to rally the troops to fight for the name of restoring the glory to the motherland. The third major European leader is Joseph Stalin. Anytime anybody wants to say communism is bad, they will directly point you to Stalinism, which is a misappropriation of communism, but that's something that we can talk about during office hours. He says, or is noted as saying, that ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? And this kind of plays back into the notion of what we talked about in terms of fascist or authoritarians not liking the individualism that comes with democracy, that this type of freedom, this type of push for a focus on the individual is something that becomes problematically divisive in the eyes of the authoritarian. So Joseph Stalin, it becomes the leader of the Communist Party. One of the things that we missed talking about in kind of wrapping up World War One around, the end of spring break, or that interwar period, is kind of talking about the Bolshevik Revolution. And one of the things that, if you want more depth or you want to talk about the Russian Civil War, and the rise of Lenin, that's something, again, we can talk about in office hours. If there are a bunch of you who want me to go over those old notes, then I can kind of add them as bonus content, because it's one of my favorite historic events to kind of talk about in terms of looking at a philosophical, political, and economic movement all at once. But he rises to power when the previous leader of the Communist Party dies, and he literally imprisons, kills, or eliminates anybody who was going to compete with him or try to push him out of power. He starts to put into play one of the classic elements of a communist economic playbook, using what's called a command style economy. He will create 5-year plans to focus on industrialization and economic growth. That Russia is lagging behind economically, developmentally, where the rest of the world was at this point in time, and he needed them to catch up, right? If the Soviet Union was going to be a massive force to not be messed with, they needed heavy industries, right? They needed to be able to produce their own iron and steel to then turn around and produce their own weapons. So he begins World War II by signing a non-aggression pact with Germany, which is essentially when we talked about spheres of influence during our colonialism and imperialism lessons, we kind of, you know, talked about drawing circles on a map and making sure that two nations circles don't overlap, or it could be seen as, you know, a hostile action. So they signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, and then invades areas in Eastern Europe instead, to kind of increase some of their uh, power projection or territory. So he is rising to power, and you know, you're seeing this notion of authoritarianism kind of encircling a lot of slowly growing democracies um, throughout Europe at the time. And these become, you know, three of kind of the core entities that individuals are worried about throughout World War II, because politically they are all aligned, philosophically they are all fairly close. So naturally, this would be a scary alliance if all three of them were able to successfully rise to power. The last country that becomes a massive player in World War II is not in Europe, but it's in Asia. We spent some time talking about the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate during our Industrial Revolution unit, where we kind of talked about how the emperor was really just, you know, a leader with no power, that they were just a ceremonial position. And there was an individual who wanted to attempt to restore the kind of pride or nobility to being the emperor again. But that starts to shift when the military in Japan gets stronger, and instead of, you know, the shogun or the leading warrior kind of running things, you now have someone who is like the top ranking institutional military official starting to run everything. So you have Hideki Tojo say that Emperor Hirohito, who is the emperor of Japan during World War II, says he'll believe what we will tell him to believe. Kind of this notion again that the military is the true center of power, and the political organ of the government, right? Whoever is designated as the leader of the country is very much fake. So uh, you have two leaders, right? You have General Hideki Tojo, who is really the puppet master of Emperor Hirohito, who is the acknowledged leader of Japan. They are not necessarily considered part of a political party, but they are noted as being militarists, right? That military might, military power, showing strength is something that inspires fear into the heart of your enemies. So you have individuals who are rising to positions of power in Japan that want to, right, uh, return to this notion of not just closed door Japan in terms of restoring pride and honor to Japan itself, but also making people afraid of Japan on the international stage. So in the same vein that we talked about, you know, the Soviet Union wanting to massively industrialize fairly quickly, Japan does the same thing. And in the area that is covered up by my ugly face and General Hideki Tojo, is the area in northeast China that used to be referred to as Manchuria. So you actually have Japan invade and conquer part of Manchuria to seize iron and coal to then be able to convert to heavy steel. So you're starting to see countries around the globe or around Europe and Asia kind of take this hard pivot to political authoritarianism. You see some nations shift from a democracy to a dictatorship. So the last thing that I want you to think about, and the second thing that we will talk about during our first week of office hours, are these two questions at the end. Number one, what does it mean that some democracies were dismantled by dictatorships? And I want you to look at the color coding of the map of Europe to help you answer that question. And then two, think about Great Britain, right? The mother of all democracy, as you know, they kind of get noted that they are a democracy that evolves over time, whereas most other democratic countries you see are democracy by revolution. So how does someone like Great Britain feel about the spread of these dictatorships, right? Where they're literally an island of democracy in a sea of countries that are converting to being something a bit more authoritarian. So think about these things. Use the starting point of the information on the three European dictators and the emperor and general of Japan to think about how things might have transitioned over time. And this will set us up for our second set of notes and activities for the week. Have a good one.